A humble delivery boy delivers flowers to a luxurious mansion where he recognizes his lost love in a portrait. But when he investigates her, he discovers a secret that connects her past with a millionaire and a son he never knew existed. João adjusted the delivery bike and carefully placed the floral arrangement in the front basket. It was a special order from a flower shop where he had worked for years. The address was unfamiliar to him, and when he arrived at the destination, he was speechless. In front of him stood an imposing mansion with a wrought iron gate, surrounded by perfectly maintained gardens. The air had a fresh, mysterious scent. For a moment, he hesitated. He had never been in such a grand place. He looked down at his work-worn hands and took a deep breath before ringing the doorbell. The metallic sound echoed through the air, and soon after, the gate opened automatically. A male voice came over an intercom. "Go ahead and leave the flowers at the main entrance." João pushed the bike to the entrance, where the solid wooden door was already ajar. The feeling of being out of place intensified as he crossed the threshold. The interior was even more impressive. High ceilings, chandeliers, and walls adorned with old paintings. A male figure appeared at the back of the room, a middle-aged man with a time-marked face and a weary expression. "Thank you for the flowers. Is that all?" the man asked, his voice dry but polite. João nodded, but something in the room caught his attention. There, hanging on the central wall, was a huge portrait of a woman. Her serene expression and piercing gaze struck him like a bolt of lightning. He felt a knot in his stomach, and time seemed to stop. It couldn't be possible. It was Mary. The man noticed João's reaction and frowned. "Is something wrong?" João shook his head quickly, but his mind was in chaos. The woman in the portrait could be none other than Maria, his old lost love. He hadn't seen her for years, ever since her life took an unexpected turn. "No, nothing. The flowers. I hope you like them." The man nodded indifferently and introduced himself. "Antonio, thank you for bringing them. You may leave now." João, still dazed, almost stumbled out of the room. As he pushed his bike back, his mind was filled with questions. How had Maria ended up in that portrait? What relationship did she have with that rich and seemingly bitter man? His heart was pounding. Translated from Spanish to English. www.onlinedoctoranslator.com. Strength as the image of her face remained etched in his mind, as vivid as the last time he had seen her. Without knowing it, that surrender would change his life forever. João walked along the cobblestone streets with erratic steps, pushing his bicycle as if every meter took him further away from the image of Maria, and at the same time brought him closer to a tangle of memories he did not want to face. Her face was still etched in his mind, the same eyes, the same expression he had known so many years ago. How could she be there, immortalized in a portrait in that opulent mansion? Night fell quickly, but João barely noticed. The city lights flickered in the distance as his mind traveled back in time. He remembered Maria as a young woman, full of life, with that laugh that brightened even the darkest days. They had been inseparable until one day she disappeared without explanation, leaving him with a void he had never been able to fill. Back at his small apartment, he sat in front of the window. The cold night wind seemed to reflect the whirlwind of emotions inside him. João knew he couldn't let this end there. Maria had been his world, and now somehow she was connected to that man named Antonio. In the morning, after a sleepless night, he decided to return to the mansion. He brought with him a banal excuse, to check if the flower arrangement had been to the client's liking. When he arrived, Antonio greeted him at the entrance with a mixture of surprise and distrust. "You again? Did something happen with the order?" João cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "I just wanted to make sure the flowers were okay. It's a special order." Antonio stared at him, as if he could see through his intentions. Finally, he nodded. "They're fine, thank you. Although I must say you seemed disturbed yesterday. Why did you keep staring at the portrait?" João felt his heart skip a beat. He hesitated for a second, but knew he couldn't lie completely. "It's just that she seemed familiar." The woman in the portrait. Antonio's expression changed, going from surprise to skepticism. "Familiar? Impossible. She was my wife. She died many years ago." The word "passed away" fell on Joan like a bucket of cold water. His whole body tensed, but he tried to keep his composure. "I'm sorry, I didn't know," she answered in a low voice, although her mind was screaming 1,000 questions. Antonio, still frowning, seemed suspicious of the answer. But instead of insisting, he changed the subject. "Thank you for worrying about the flowers. That will be all." Joan nodded and walked slowly out, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that something deeper was at play. As he walked away from the mansion, memories of Maria continued to flood back to him, but with renewed pain. What had happened in all those years? What secrets did that house hold? His mind was made up. He had to go back. Joan sat on the edge of his bed, his hands shaking, holding an old photograph. In it, Maria smiled as the sun lit up her hair, which fell in curls over her shoulders. It was a memory he had kept hidden for years, one of the few traces he had left of her. That smile, so full of life, was the same one he had seen in the portrait in the mansion, but now mixed with an air of mystery that tormented him. He had met Maria in a distant summer when they were both young and their dreams seemed endless. He remembered afternoons by the river where they would talk about the future, imagining a life together. But those dreams had been shattered when she disappeared without warning, leaving behind a void and unanswered questions. Joan returned to that last conversation they had had. It was a cloudy day, and Maria seemed distracted, as if she carried an invisible weight on her shoulders. "I have to go away for a while," she had said in an evasive tone. Joan, unable to understand, had insisted that she stay, but Maria did not explain further. And then, like a wind that sweeps everything away, she had disappeared. It was years before Joan accepted that Maria was not coming back. He had tried to move on, but deep down he always harbored the hope that one day he would find her. And now suddenly, she was back in his life, but not in the way he had imagined. At the mansion, Antonio was also trapped in his own memories. Sitting in an armchair in front of the portrait, a glass of wine in his hand, his eyes wandered over Maria's face. The portrait had been commissioned shortly after their marriage, at a time when everything seemed perfect. But that perfection had crumbled when illness claimed her. Antonio had built his fortune with effort, but no amount of money could save it. His thoughts were interrupted by the memory of the delivery man who had been there the day before. Something about Joan's reaction to the portrait had unsettled him. He had seen many expressions of admiration towards the painting, but never one that conveyed such connection, such pain. Antonio swirled the glass in his hand, wondering who this man was and why Maria seemed to have some connection to him. The next day, Joan decided to return to the mansion. His mind was set, although he did not know exactly what he was looking for. It was as if a greater force was pushing him towards that place. When he arrived, his heart was beating hard, but fear did not stop him. This time, Antonio did not hide his annoyance at seeing him again. "What do you really want?" he asked, his tone cold and direct. Joan took a breath and answered cautiously. "I want answers. That woman in the portrait, Maria, I knew her." Antonio looked at him with disbelief and some irritation. "That's impossible. Maria was my wife. What kind of game are you trying to play?" Joan clenched his fists, struggling to remain calm. "I'm not playing. Many years ago, before she was with you, we were something more." The tension in the room was palpable. Antonio set his glass down and leaned forward, a mixture of disbelief and fury on his face. "I warn you, do not dirty his memory with lies." Joan stared at him, his eyes filled with genuine sadness. "Anana, I'm not lying. I need to know what happened to her after she disappeared from my life." Antonio, though still wary, sensed something in Joan's tone that made him hesitate. But he wasn't ready to open up. Not yet. "You better go," he said finally, ending the conversation. Joan left the mansion, but this time he didn't feel defeated. He knew there was something else, a secret buried in Maria's past that he needed to uncover. Joan couldn't get Antonio's expression on his last visit out of his mind. Although he had been rejected, he felt that his words had left a chink in the distant man's armor. He knew he had to return, but this time with more caution, and above all, with the truth as his only weapon. The next morning dawned gray, as if the sky reflected the uncertainty he carried in his chest. Joan returned to the mansion, feeling the weight of each step as he pushed his bicycle. Upon arrival, he was greeted by a servant who looked at him suspiciously before escorting him back to the main hall. Antonio was sitting in the same chair, his posture rigid as a statue. When João entered, he barely looked up. "I didn't expect to see you again. I assume you have something important to say," he said in a dry and cold tone. João nodded, trying not to be intimidated. "I need to talk about Maria." The name seemed to hang in the air, filling the awkward silence that followed. Antonio frowned, clearly irritated. "What can you know about my wife that I don't?" João took a step forward, his voice firm though trembling inside. "I met her before you. We were together. We were a couple." Antonio's reaction was immediate. He stood up suddenly, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and surprise. "That's impossible! You dare to come here and claim something so absurd?" João stood firm, even though his heart was beating like a drum. "I'm not here to claim anything. I just want to know the truth. What happened after he disappeared from my life?" Antonio glared at him, but behind that angry mask there was something else: confusion. João saw the doubt in his gaze and decided to press on. "I met Maria in a small town, many years ago. She always wore a silver medallion. She said it was a reminder of her mother." Antonio, who until then seemed sure of himself, hesitated upon hearing that mention. "A medallion?" he asked, almost in a whisper. João nodded, knowing he had struck a chord. "It was small, with a floral print on the back. Maria wore it all the time." Antonio sank back into the chair, his expression different, something between disbelief and resignation. For a long moment, silence reigned in the room. Finally, he spoke, his tone more restrained but still defiant. "I don't know how you know that, but it doesn't mean anything. My wife didn't mention anything about you or her past." João looked at him sadly. Maybe he didn't want to mention it. Maybe he was trying to protect himself from something or someone. Antonio clenched his fists, clearly upset. "You're playing with fire, boy. I don't know what your intentions are, but I don't want to see you here again." The order was clear, but João did not back down. "I'm not looking for conflict, just the truth. I'll be back, Antonio. I won't rest until I understand why Maria disappeared and how she ended up here with you." Antonio didn't answer, just pointed at the door. João left, leaving behind a silence full of tension. As he walked back, he knew he had accomplished something. He had planted a doubt in Antonio. Now it was up to him to decide whether he would face the past or bury it again. The cold night air enveloped João as he walked through the streets, lost in his thoughts. The conversation with Antonio had been a challenge, but also a confirmation that he was on the right path. There was something the man didn't want to admit, and João was determined to find out. That night, João decided to investigate. He searched for information in public records, libraries, and even on local social media. He discovered something surprising. Maria had left her hometown shortly after their separation, and less than a year later, she had married Antonio. The wedding had been discreet, but the publications in old local newspapers did not go unnoticed, which spoke of the union between a promising young businessman and a mysterious woman with a secretive past. On the other hand, Antonio couldn't sleep. João's words echoed in his mind. How could this stranger know such intimate details about Maria? Although he tried to convince himself that it was a coincidence or even a lie, something inside him told him that he had to investigate further. The next morning, Antonio opened an old trunk that he had kept closed for years. Inside, he found letters, photographs, and small belongings of Maria's that he had never had the courage to look at in depth. His hand trembled as he pulled out a small velvet box. Opening it, he saw the medallion that João had described so precisely, a piece of silver with engraved flowers. It was the one object that Maria had never stopped wearing, even in the most difficult times. He picked up one of the letters Maria had written but never sent. Her words, though ambiguous, revealed fragments of a past Antonio did not fully understand. "I have tried to leave behind what I was, but there are things that never go away. I only hope that you find in me the peace that I myself continue to seek." Antonio sighed, leaving the medallion on a nearby table. "There's something I must show you." He stood up and left the room for a moment, returning with an aged wooden box. He opened it in front of João, revealing a series of letters, photographs, and small objects that had belonged to Maria. Joan took one of the photographs. It was a picture of Maria in the mansion, wearing a dress. Meanwhile, Joan continued his investigation. Each clue led him back to the same point. Maria had abruptly changed her life. He spoke to an old acquaintance of both, who confirmed something that chilled his blood. Maria had been pregnant before she left. The revelation paralyzed him. Had she had a child? Was it possible that Antonio? Without a second thought, Joan returned to the mansion that same afternoon. Antonio greeted him with the same distrust as before, but this time his gaze had something more, a mixture of doubt and curiosity. "You came back as you promised. What do you want now?" Antonio asked coldly, although it was clear that he wanted answers as much as Joan. Joan took a deep breath before answering. "I've discovered something I think you need to know too. Maria was pregnant when she left my life." Antonio stared at him, his face showing a mix of surprise and confusion. "Are you saying that?" Joan nodded slowly. "I'm not sure of everything, but there is something that connects our paths. You know as much as I do that she kept secrets." Antonio, visibly disturbed, took the medallion out of his jacket pocket and held it in front of Joan. She never stopped using it. Why did she never talk about you?" Joan felt a deep pain in his chest when he saw the jewel. It was tangible proof that everything he had said was true. Maybe she thought I wouldn't be good enough for her. Or maybe she just wanted to start over. Silence stretched between them, but this time it was less hostile. Both men looked at each other, understanding that they were connected by something bigger than their own feelings. Maria's past and the son she had left in their lives without explanation. The hall of the mansion seemed larger and colder as Antonio and Joan remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. The medallion Antonio had taken out was still in his hand, shining in the dim light of the evening. Joan looked at it with a mixture of nostalgia and regret, as if every detail of that piece transported him to the days when Maria was his world. Antonio, though he tried hard to maintain his composure, could not ignore the turmoil that was stirring inside him. He had spent so many years idealizing Maria, believing that he knew her completely, and now this man appeared, shaking the image he had built of her. "What else do you know about Maria?" Antonio finally asked, breaking the silence with a more restrained tone, though still full of suspicion. Joan took a deep breath before answering. "I know she loved the simple life, that she liked walks in the fresh air, the sound of the river, and that locket." She paused, pointing at it with her eyes. It was the only thing she kept from her mother. She looked after it as if it were part of her. Antonio nodded slowly, remembering the times he had seen Maria cling to the locket in silence, as if seeking comfort from it. "It's true," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. He never talked much about his past. He only mentioned that there were things he preferred to forget. I respected his silence, but now I wonder, how much did he really keep from me? Joan took a step forward, feeling the wall between them beginning to crumble. "Maybe she didn't hide things from you out of lack of trust, but out of fear. Maria always had a way of protecting those she loved, even if it meant walking away." Antonio looked at him, trying to read the sincerity in his eyes. There was something in Joan's words that resonated with the Maria he had known, but there were still too many unanswered questions. "If what you say is true, if you really were with her before we met, why did she never mention anything?" Joan looked down, fighting the weight of memories. "I don't know. When he disappeared, I thought there was something I had done wrong, that I had failed in some way, but now I think it was his decision, one he made because he believed it was the best." Elegant, but her eyes had a dull gleam, a melancholy that he recognized immediately. "She never talked about a son," Antonio said, almost as if he were talking to himself. "But if what you say is true, that changes everything." Joan nodded, his emotions conflicting. "I think that son is our bond, and we have to find him, Antonio." The two men looked at each other, aware that this path to truth would unite them in a way neither had anticipated. The tension between Joan and Antonio was palpable as the pieces of the past began to fit together. The wooden box on the table had become a symbol of the mystery that bound them together. Antonio, frowning and hands shaking, opened one of the letters Maria had written but never sent. Joan watched in silence, aware that those words held truths that could change everything. "This is from the first years of our marriage," Antonio said, running his fingers over the yellowed paper. His voice was heavy with a tone that mixed sadness and doubt. Maria wrote a lot, but she spoke little. Joan leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Antonio's face as he began to read aloud. "Dear Antonio, there are things in my life that I haven't had the courage to tell you. Things that haunt me even on the happiest days. I don't want my shadows to cloud what we built together, but sometimes I feel like the weight of the past is too great. I've tried to leave behind everything I was before I found you, but there's something I'll never be able to forget. I hope that one day you can understand my silences and my decisions." The silence that followed was overwhelming. Joan felt a lump in his throat. Each word confirmed what he had suspected. Maria had carried a secret with her, one that even Antonio did not fully know. Antonio left the letter on the table and sighed deeply. She didn't mention a child, but it's clear that something was tormenting her, something she never wanted to share with me. Joan swallowed before speaking. "Maria was pregnant when she left the village. I know this because she told me herself, shortly before she disappeared. I never knew what happened afterwards, but now I understand that that child could have been raised as yours." Antonio looked up, his eyes filled with disbelief. "That can't be true. My son, our son." Joan interrupted him carefully, his voice heavy with regret. "I'm not saying this to take anything away from you, Antonio, but it's important that we know the truth. Not for us, but for him, for our son." The word "our" echoed through the room like an endless echo. Antonio stood up from his seat and began to pace back and forth, trying to process what he had just heard. Joan watched him, giving him space, but without losing his firm position. Finally, Antonio stopped in front of a photograph hanging on the wall, a portrait of a smiling young man in his 20s. "My son, Eduardo," she said quietly. He's always been mine. I raised him as my blood, watched him grow, made sure he had everything he needed." Joan nodded slowly. "And he will always be your son. But he also deserves to know who Maria really was. He deserves to know where he came from." Antonio closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to contain a wave of emotions. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost resigned. "I don't know how he'll take it. He's a grown man. He has his own life. But if this is true, we can't hide it from him." Joan stepped forward, his eyes filled with determination. "What we do now will define his future and his perception of Maria. No matter how difficult it is, we must tell him the truth." Antonio nodded slowly, accepting the reality they both had to face. That night, under the shadow of Maria's portrait, the two men began to plan how to reveal the secret that had remained buried for so many years. The news was a weight that neither of the men knew how to bear. Antonio locked himself in his office for hours, reviewing the few memories of Maria that he had kept, while Joan remained in his modest apartment, trapped between guilt and uncertainty. They both knew that, sooner or later, they would have to face Eduardo. But how do you tell a son that his entire life is based on a secret? Antonio was torn. On the one hand, he felt a deep betrayal towards Maria for not telling him the whole truth. On the other, he couldn't help but question himself. Had he intentionally turned a blind eye to the gaps in her story? He had always known Maria kept secrets, but he chose not to press, fearing what he might discover. Now the price of his silence was this devastating revelation. That afternoon, Eduardo stopped by the mansion to visit him, as he did every week. He was a young man, with the energy and confidence that Antonio had always admired in him. As they chatted about trivialities in the living room, Antonio couldn't help but watch him with a mixture of love and sadness. Every gesture, every smile, now made him wonder if Joan's blood ran in his blood. Eduardo noticed his father's tension and confronted him. "Is everything okay? You seem strange, as if you want to tell me something, but you don't know how." Antonio shook his head, unable to form the words. "I'm fine, just a lot of things on my mind lately." Eduardo didn't insist, but the doubt remained in the air. When he left, Antonio felt that he had lost an invaluable opportunity. He knew that he couldn't delay it any longer. Meanwhile, João was reflecting on his role in this situation. He had lost so many years, and now when he finally found a trace of his son, he felt like an intruder. He couldn't deny that. Although he wanted to meet him, he was also afraid of what Eduardo would think of him. Would he be able to understand? Or would he reject him for having been absent all his life? That night, João made a decision. He wrote a letter to Antonio, explaining his position and his intentions. In it, he made it clear that he was not seeking to take anything from him, but only to build a bridge to reach Eduardo. "I am not here to replace you or question what you have done for him," he wrote. "I just want the opportunity to meet him and tell him who Maria was to me." The next day, Antonio received the letter. Reading it, he felt a strange relief. For the first time, he understood that João was not an enemy, but someone caught in the same whirlpool of emotions. With the letter in his hand, he sat in front of Maria's portrait and, looking into her immortalized eyes, promised her that he would do the right thing. That promise would mark the beginning of a joint effort to face the truth and heal the wounds that the past had left. João's letter sat on Antonio's desk for hours. He had read every word over and over, and although he still felt a mix of skepticism and resistance, something in João's sincere tone resonated deeply with him. Antonio realized that continuing to ignore the truth would only prolong everyone's suffering, including Eduardo. Finally, he decided to take the first step. That same afternoon, Antonio called João. "I've read your letter," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Maybe you're right. It's time we face this together." João felt immediate relief upon hearing those words. Although the path was still uncertain, he knew that this was the first step towards something bigger. That evening, the two men met at a small cafe away from the mansion. The atmosphere was less tense than their previous encounters, but the weight of what they planned to do was still present in every word. "Eduardo must know, but we have to be careful," Antonio said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. "He has always seen me as his father. Telling him this could change everything." João nodded, understanding the magnitude of what was at stake. "I'm not here to take that place from you. You'll always be her father. All I want is for her to understand who Maria really was, and who I am." Antonio looked at him closely, searching for any sign of doubt or deception, but all he found was sincerity. "Then we'll do it together. But first, I need to prepare Eduardo." The next day, Antonio invited Eduardo to the mansion for a private conversation. Sitting in the same room where so many secrets had come to light, Antonio began cautiously. "Son, there's something about your mother that we never talked about. Something I think you need to know." Eduardo looked at him, clearly confused by his father's serious tone. "Anything about Mom? I always thought I knew everything there was to know about her." Antonio took a deep breath before continuing. "Your mother had a past before I met her, a past she never fully shared with me. But recently, someone came along who was a part of that life." The confusion on Eduardo's face gave way to a mix of curiosity and concern. "Who is that person?" Antonio paused, choosing his words carefully. "His name is João. He was someone important to your mother before she and I met. There is something you should know about him and about yourself." The conversation continued for hours, with Antonio explaining what he had discovered and leaving space for Eduardo to process the information. When he finished, Eduardo remained silent, his mind working to take it all in. "Do you want me to meet him?" he finally asked. Antonio nodded slowly. "I think you should, not because it changes who you and I are, but because it might give you a new perspective on your mother." Days later, the meeting was arranged. João arrived at the mansion with a mixture of nerves and hope. Upon entering the living room, his eyes met Eduardo's. For a moment, they both stood still, studying each other. "Eduardo," said Antonio, breaking the silence, "this is João." João took a step forward, feeling like every move was a leap into the void. "Hi, Eduardo. I know this must be strange for you, but I'm here because I want to share something about your mother, something you may never have known." Eduardo listened to him in silence, still processing the idea that this man could have some connection to his life. Although his emotions were complex, there was no hostility in his gaze, only curiosity. It was a beginning. The room, normally cold and silent, seemed charged with an energy that none of those present could ignore. João and Eduardo looked at each other with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Antonio remained standing near the window, watching attentively, but not intervening. This moment was too important to force. Both men had to find their own rhythm. João took a deep breath before speaking. "I don't know where to begin," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But I think the most important thing is for you to know that your mother was someone extraordinary. Someone who marked my life in a way that I could never forget." Eduardo nodded slowly, without taking his eyes off João. "My father told me about you and what you meant to her, but I don't understand why he never mentioned anything." João paused, searching for the right words. "I think she wanted to protect you, to give you a life without complications. Maria was like that. She always put others before herself." Eduardo seemed to ponder these words before answering. "She was always a mystery to me. She never talked much about her past, but I always felt there was something she didn't want to share." João nodded, recognizing that same trait in Maria. "What matters now is that you are the most beautiful legacy she left behind. I am not here to change your life, Eduardo. I just want you to know where you come from and, if you allow me, to share with you the stories of who Maria was before we both met her." Eduardo looked at Antonio as if seeking confirmation. His father returned a calm but meaningful look. "Whatever you decide, son, is fine, but I think he deserves a chance." The atmosphere slowly began to relax. João pulled an old photograph from his pocket, a picture of Maria when she was young, with her smile radiant and full of life. Eduardo took it carefully, observing every detail. "I've never seen her like this before," he said, his tone somewhere between wonder and nostalgia. "She looks happy." João smiled, his eyes filled with tears. "I was, and I'm sure I still was, when I was with you and Antonio." That night marked the beginning of something new. João and Eduardo began to talk more, sharing memories, questions, and moments that slowly wove an unexpected bond. Antonio, although at first he kept a certain emotional distance, began to see João as something more than a man from the past, someone who, despite the circumstances, wanted the best for his son. Weeks later, the three men met at the cemetery in front of Maria's grave. In silence, they laid flowers and each made a promise. Antonio to continue to honor her memory, João to keep her story alive, Eduardo to accept her legacy. "And we'll do it together. But first, I need to prepare Eduardo." The next day, Antonio invited Eduardo to the mansion for a private conversation. Sitting in the same room where so many secrets had come to light, Antonio began cautiously. "Son, there's something about your mother that we never talked about. Something I think you need to know." Eduardo looked at him, clearly confused by his father's serious tone. "Anything about Mom? I always thought I knew everything there was to know about her." Antonio took a deep breath before continuing. "Your mother had a past before I met her, a past she never fully shared with me. But recently, someone came along who was a part of that life." The confusion on Eduardo's face gave way to a mix of curiosity and concern. "Who is that person?" Antonio paused, choosing his words carefully. "His name is João. He was someone important to your mother before she and I met. There is something you should know about him and about yourself." The conversation continued for hours, with Antonio explaining what he had discovered and leaving space for Eduardo to process the information. When he finished, Eduardo remained silent, his mind working to take it all in. "Do you want me to meet him?" he finally asked. Antonio nodded slowly. "I think you should, not because it changes who you and I are, but because it might give you a new perspective on your mother." Days later, the meeting was arranged. João arrived at the mansion with a mixture of nerves and hope. Upon entering the living room, his eyes met Eduardo's. For a moment, they both stood still, studying each other. "Eduardo," said Antonio, breaking the silence. Together, they had found a new definition of family, built on truth, respect, and a shared love for the same woman. Sometimes the past comes back in unexpected ways, forcing us to face truths we have avoided for years. The story of João, Antonio, and Eduardo teaches us that love and family are not always defined by blood, but by the courage to accept the truth and build a bridge to reconciliation. What would you have done in Joan's place? Would you have sought the truth or left the past behind? Click on the video on the screen to continue this fascinating exploration of the secrets that define us and the decisions that change our lives. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories full of emotion and learning. See you in the next video.